All right, Leroy Slanzi. How's it going, sir?
Good, man. It's nice to be here with you today.
It's a pleasure to have you on. I'm excited to get talking to you today about some of your work. I guess first off, again, we kind of just met there a few minutes ago, but we're talking about the pursuit of new knowledge in education. So, as you have recently published your own book, Emotional Schools, what did you kind of see that was missing from the realm of education as you were trying to investigate that problem of mental health and how things are changing in our schools today?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that I've seen is the change in kids' behavior and not just recently. I'll go back 10, 15 years where I started to see a lot of educators started to see kids who are sleep deprived showing up to school and heads down on their desk and just not coping with the rigors of day-to-day academia because they're up on their gaming systems or they're on their phones, and this infusion of technology has sort of taken root within a lot of families. And on top of it, the other piece to that is not only kids on technology, it's parents on technology. So there's this separation of parental attachment and whatnot. And I think what's happened since I've started to see kids sleep deprived is just this escalation of behavior year after year after year. It turns into more kids and more kids and more kids unable to cope with the smallest stressors in class, which of course then falls onto the shoulders of our greatest asset, which is our teachers.
Yeah, and even I love the sleep deprivation and the technology connection, but as we kind of look at screen time, I guess one of the things I would like to ask you, I guess, in kind of what you've looked into in that realm is even for myself, I kind of I turned my screen time off. I was like, I don't want to see I don't maybe it's like a I don't want to see my own kind of negativity. I don't need that in my life
Yeah.
kind of thing. But to me, it's like, oh, like I'm only 2 hours a day. But then
Yeah.
you come home and then you watch Netflix with your wife or with your kids, and then it's okay. Well, that was another 2 hours. And so, in your kind of looking into the screen time section of like how is screen time impacting our kids as well?
Yeah, and it's interesting you say that because I think on our iPhones it sends us alerts or notifications of how long we're on our phones. You
Mm-hmm.
get those and you're kind of like, oh
It's
God,
like
I've been on there for
no.
6 hours today, right? And it's really hard because we live in a technological world now, and it's a struggle for parents and it's a struggle for kids because we're more connected than we've ever been. And so, it's kind of like having the devil on one shoulder and an angel on another shoulder. And I get asked often, where's the happy medium? And I have to always kind of go back to whether or not you've instilled that intrinsic motivation in your kids. And once you've established that your kids are intrinsically motivated and curious, well, then you can start introducing technology, and it becomes less of the devil and more of the angel, because technology has a lot of amazing things to it as well. Like there's things we're doing with technology that are going to save the world, and but there's also things with technology that are going to hurt a lot of children and a lot of kids. And I think in all the studies and the research I did before writing my book, and just a lot of it came from personal experience. I've been in the school system for 25 years, and my research started with experience. And so I've watched, since I started in the year 2000, I think is when I first started as a teacher. I've watched this migration of kids' inability to cope um, increasingly change from year one of being an educator to now year 25, which, led me to go down the path of, holy man, there's a real mental health issue in our schools. And the further I dug into the research to support my opinion and my experience in the school, the more, you saw, or I saw, um, the research on how, disconnected our kids are from other people and how disconnected adults are from other people, and those interpersonal communication skills and that those attachment bonds are slowly disappearing with the infusion of technology. And what the research shows is the further we disassociate from human connection, the further our kids go down the path of being unable to cope with small stressors or interact properly. Their ability to communicate and recognize communication cues, their ability to deal with conflict, all of that stuff is waning. And at the crux of it all, as we lose those attachment bonds and those interpersonal connections, for kids, it starts with play. And you go back, you know, 15, 20 years ago, kids were playing a lot more than they are now. And that's where you develop those character traits, right? So bit of a long-winded answer, but I think
No, that's
you kind
good.
of get the gist, right?
I love it. But I'm even wondering too, because I like that you use kind of the words coping and small stressors, because I guess for myself, kind of only being in teaching for about half a decade now, what are the kind of small stressors that you like students used to be able to kind of just like, no, like they kind of process it, they go through, they keep going. Like, what are the things that are starting to shut our students down now that didn't 15 years ago?
Well, I use something very simple. I'll use an example that I saw on Friday. I had to leave early on Friday because my daughter had a volleyball tournament in another town. But before I left, I had to go and deal with a very dramatic situation, and with this kid couldn't get his boots on, lost it.
It's
Lost, and this is what I'm talking
a
about.
big
Like,
moment.
even it's a big moment, and we're not talking about a kid in kindergarten. Because kids in kindergarten, they still have their shoes on the wrong feet. They get frustrated with trying to tie their shoes. Some of those, things that they're learning how to do. We're talking about a kid in grade 3. It's very, very smart kid, intellectually sound, but lost it over not being able to get his shoes on. And so it's things like that you're starting to see these micro uh, encounters that kids are having, whether it be with something to do writing the letter B on a piece of paper, or being able to find something in their locker, or just that ability to problem solve. And like this kid with his boots, for example, he couldn't problem solve. He couldn't stick his hand in his shoe and realize that the insert, you're from Canada, so you get snow boots.
Yeah.
The insert was messed. All he needed to do was stick his hand in there and kind of pat it away, and he could have slipped his boot on. We're Canadian. If I would have did that when I was 8, my dad would have thought I was crazy because you're born in snow boots here, right? And
Yeah.
so it's things like that, and you're seeing classroom teachers, and you're probably seeing it. Although you might be used to it, if you're only 5 years in, you're probably seeing it. You probably think it's the norm, but 20, 25 years ago, you don't deal with a kid in his snow boots, or, maybe in kindergarten with a kid putting his one-piece snowsuit on, or,
Hmm.
but things like that, those little micro conflicts, those little tiny stressors that kids typically could work through, they don't have the ability or the coping mechanisms to work through them as much as they did. And I just need to make sure for your listeners understand that we're talking, not every kid in a class. If a class has
Hmm.
30 kids, we're talking, 8 to 10 kids. However, 15 years ago, that was 2 kids, 1 kid. And now what we're seeing is every year that number's gone from 3 kids to 4 kids to 7 kids to 8 kids to 10 kids. And then so you have this class of 30, and that's probably on the bigger side. In BC, in kindergarten to grade 3, class sizes is maxed at 22, and or 24, I should say. So if you think about that, though, if you think about having 7 to 8 kids unable to handle the smallest of stressors, those little micro conflicts that, are not with classmates, but just potentially objects, or getting from one place to the other and classmates, and then trying to be a teacher who has to teach a math lesson or teach some kids something around literacy while you're trying to put out these little fires for kids who can't cope, right? And
Hmm.
that's where the technology piece comes in, because when parents are on their phones and kids are on their phones, or on their gaming systems, that attachment is gone, and kids should be raised in a co-regulation type of a system, right? Where parents are there when kids struggle. Parents are there to encourage, to talk them through that, to help them take
Hmm.
some deep breaths. You got this, we can do it. Not not jumping in and saving them, because that's also part of what's going on for us in school system is we have
Hmm.
helicopter parents and lawnmower parents. But that whole Barbara
Wait, what's
Coloroso
a
kind of
lawnmower
idea,
parent?
it's when you kind of mow the lawn in front of kids so they have no conflict and you get everything out of the way. You've never heard that expression before?
No, I've heard helicopter, but never heard
Oh yeah,
lawnmower.
no, the
I
lawnmower
like
parent, it's
that.
like, let me move this rock, let me move this chair,
Oh, like you're clearing the path all the
you're
time almost?
clearing the
Okay,
path,
I
right?
like
and
that. All
and
right.
and you know what, and I, as parents, we need to clear some paths, but we
Yeah,
also need to have some, the kids got to run the gauntlet, right? You want your
yeah.
child to
You gotta
persevere,
roll your
develop
ankle a
that.
few times to build some character.
Dude, I saw, and this is where technology is great. I saw this video on TikTok where this guy was doing this thing. It's like, how often do you see a kid in a cast nowadays?
It's
You
true.
don't see it. You don't see it very often, and
Hmm.
when I grew up, I mean, I'm not saying let's not go back to no helmets and being unsafe,
No.
but there's so much clearance, and that's the problem that we're seeing, is that
Yeah.
kids don't have as much attachment with their parents, so their parents aren't teaching them how to self-soothe. There's that
Hmm.
co-regulation piece to teach independency is diffused, and then as a result we have kids in classrooms, and the problem is with behavior is when kids don't understand what they're feeling, if they don't understand their emotion, you're going to see, emotion that might come out from a kid just being sad, or a kid crawling under his
Hmm.
desk, to a kid saying F you, right? And
That
it's
happens.
just on the spectrum, right? And the kid who's saying F you and the kid who's really sad over something could be experiencing the exact same micro stressor, if that
Yeah.
makes sense, right? And that's the part where, it was important for me to write this book, was because, God, we have to really help kids understand emotions, label emotions,
Mhm.
and then cope with emotions, because it's coming. And there's a lot of people not going into the profession, quitting the profession these days
Yeah.
now because of what they're seeing, right?
Absolutely. So I'm taking in all these nuggets as you're going, because I'm even thinking like it's almost the more connected we are, the more detached we are. It's kind of what I'm seeing. It's like as that again, it's not supposed to be that way. Obviously, we're supposed to feel even more kind of in tune with our community, but and even to kind of follow that up, a few questions I've asked. I had my former like associate superintendent on at one point. We were just kind of generally talking about why some it's not even that teachers are generally leaving the profession en masse, which they are, but it's also just this mass exodus of people like applying for education programs and actually kind of keeping up that pipeline going anyway. Because I'm curious to say, it seems to me in my 5 years that we've been in a mental health crisis, like again, like kind of globally with COVID, but then even in schools, almost even more specifically. My question I asked him was, like, I know we're kind of moving toward crisis, but what does the crisis point actually look like? And you kind of emphasize the looming crisis of mental health. So I guess if we've kind of been in a crisis for 5 years or more, like what do you kind of see on the horizon as something that we're not really paying enough attention to?
Yeah. The reason why I say it's a looming crisis is because we're not at that tipping point yet.
Hmm.
When I say there's 24 kids in the class and 7 or 8 are unable to cope, that means 16, 17 kids are pretty, you're pretty average, typical kid, right?
Hmm.
But even those kids, I think, are probably, a little too immersed in social media, aren't playing as much. And that's why I say it's looming, because, I think about, I use this analysis. So I hate using the term classroom management because I believe in behavior education.
Hmm.
And I think when you use classroom management, it's basically you're just controlling kids rather than let them kind of be their own boss and figure it out, right? And so when I look at behavior education and I look at your class, you always have your class where you have, 2 or 3 kids who drive you kind of crazy and they're really challenging. And then you have 2 or 3 kids who are on the other end who are just amazing, getting all their work done. They're polite, they're kind, and then you have, another 2 or 3 kids who are still struggling with stress. And then you're on the other, kind of getting close to this fence, right? And right now we have a whack of kids that are sitting on the fence. So we have 7 kids over here, 7 kids over here, and then we have another 8 kids that are sitting on the fence. And
Hmm.
that's what's looming. If we can just get these fence sitters to shift this way and pull these kids up, we won't go into a full blown crisis. However, the way it's going right now in school systems and school districts all over the world, not just this isn't just a Canadian problem. This is a United States problem. It's an Australia problem. It's a New Zealand problem. It's a Europe problem. Right now, is what we're seeing is those fence sitters are starting to shift. And what happens is when those sitters shift, they just pull, right? Think about yourself. You're falling off a boat and you're grabbing your buddy to try to save yourself,
Mhm.
right? And so I think that's what's happening. And we have to make this shift where those fence sitters start to pull the kids who are struggling with coping and dealing with whatever type of conflict it is, that direction. And
Mhm.
so, I think, part of what feels like that we're in a mental health crisis is the fact that there's a teacher shortage. Teachers aren't applying for jobs. Since COVID, you see more teachers who are choosing to retire early instead of sticking it out for a couple more years. I mean, you have the odd teacher who are trying to maximize their pension, and so they're sticking
Mhm.
around and stuff like that. But what you're seeing is you're
But
seeing
that's the
more.
reason they're doing it. It's not because it's like they still have, yeah.
Yeah, it's not their because teaching's a calling, right? You don't go
Mhm.
into teaching because you know because you think it's
I'm
going to
gonna be a
get you rich.
millionaire.
That's right. You get into teaching because you care about society, you care about how the world is going to how you can shape the world. And I think what's happening is you're seeing less and less of that, right? And I think so for me, like it's hard. When I first became a principal 17 years ago, I'd post a job, I'd have 24, 25 applicants, right? Now I post a job, I have none. And I'm trying to recruit out of Ontario, Eastern Canada, Alberta, and people used to love coming to BC. Part
Mhm.
of the other piece to that problem is it's so expensive to live in BC, so that's hard for
Yeah.
us. But and so that's why it feels like we're in a bit of a crisis, because you're not recruiting top-notch teachers. You're not even, I mean, not right now, I don't have very many substitute teachers. The ones that I do are elders, and then I basically pull special education assistants into the classroom. They're on letters
Mhm.
of permission. Thank God they're really good and they do well in our school. But if I was in a big district, you'd be screwed, right? And
Mhm.
then that exasperates that conflict and those difficulties for schools, and makes that mental health crisis feel like it's right here.
Well, yeah, because it's also kind of, and this could be a whole other conversation of like the lack of experience kind of slowly bleeding into the higher experience positions where you kind of see people becoming vice principals at 28 and 29 when
Hmm. Hmm.
realistically, like, again, not that they're not good at their jobs, nor were they good at teaching, but that it's very young for actually trying to move into those positions. Like, so I guess I've done a little bit of discussion on like my new position because I just moved from Alberta to New Brunswick.
Oh,
And
okay.
so I'm in St. John now, and I think part of the, I guess you're kind of making me reframe the way I kind of approach my position is kind of pulling people back to this side of the fence and not letting them fall. Um, but like I'm an academic support teacher, so basically I'm like a branch of a resource team where
Okay.
I don't work with PLP students, or like IPP PLP students, kind of different acronym everywhere.
Yep, I get
But
it.
I am basically tier two support.
Okay.
So everyone who's kind of like, if you're grade 8, but you're at a grade 5, 6 level, that's kind of who I work with to get you kind of up to grade level. So that's kind of, I'm like the catch up
Got it.
guy, which
Hmm.
um, catch up without the mustard, I guess. But I'm
Yep.
kind of basically trying to get everyone back up to par. So I guess that's kind of is that something that you've heard as a general trend in BC as well? And like trying to design new kind of niche positions to try and accommodate some of these needs?
Well, I'm a special education teacher originally.
Okay. Yeah.
I did my master's in special ed, so I've worked in learning assistance. So it's not new.
Mhm.
Um, it's something that's been around. So I actually just finished my third book. It's called The New Leadership Paradigm, Beyond Credentials and the Letters Behind Your Name.
Mhm.
And one of the pillars, so I talk about leadership pillars, and one of the pillars that I talk about in my new book revolves around structural leadership and how you structure your school. And within that, one of the things that I've done now, I've been in, God, 6, 7 schools. I've kind of lost count where I've been an administrator. The first thing that I do when I go into a school is I centralize student services physically. I physically will centralize the student service support. So whether I'm in an elementary, middle, or a high school, I will physically move classrooms so learning assistance is in the middle of the building. The special ed, for low incidence kids are in the center of the building. I move the counseling department to the center of the building. I move the indigenous classroom to the center of the building. So it becomes the heart and soul of what you do. That way, because you go into a lot of schools and the learning assistance classroom is pushed off to the corner, or the
Yeah.
special ed classroom is pushed off over here, or the indigenous support room, First Nation support workers room is pushed off over here, or the counseling department is somewhere where nobody can find it. And so your teachers like yourself, your tier 2, tier 3 interventionists, you guys are the domino. If you don't step up and support those kids, that is drastically going to affect classroom teachers. They
Mhm.
need their student services support badly. And so, in terms of structuring, not just the job roles, whether you're a learning assistance teacher or a special ed teacher, or an indigenous support worker, or a special ed assistant, or a speech language pathologist, or an occupational therapist, having that centralized allows teachers and students to constantly have to walk through that area, which increases inclusivity. But it
Yeah.
also puts the most valuable people in your school at the fingertips of the adults and the students and the parents. So if you had to have a school-based team meeting where you're having an IEP meeting about a particular kid and you need parents to come in, you're right there, you're centrally located, right? So, that response to intervention there, the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 thing, it's very important that, you have a guy like you, you have a tier 3 person, the special ed teacher, you have the classroom teacher who tries to tackle all 3 tiers, because that's what,
Mhm.
they should be doing, with the support of people like yourself and student services. But that's the key, is to make sure that you have people in the right roles. So when
Mhm.
that teacher struggles with tier 2, Lucas gets to walk in, Mr. Clark gets to walk in and say, hey, I got you. This kid's 2 grade levels behind, or they have a gap, let's say in math, and they can't get adding fractions. They can't figure out common denominators. Let me get them caught up and get them back into your math class so they don't fall too far behind,
Mhm.
kind of thing, right? So it's, in terms of how you structure your school and you structure your roles and responsibilities, you can support each other, right? So if you don't structure your school that way, and if you don't have people in the right roles to support those 3 tiers of intervention, that mental health crisis is going to come even sooner, going back to the original topic.
Yeah, because it's funny that you say that, because like our school right now, I have two questions actually. So my school right now, it's like for our resource room. When you walk in, it's right there at the front, right next to the office. So it almost feels like an admin branch rather than like a classroom branch, which is kind of more so what it should
Right.
be, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And the class where I've been doing my like pullout work is like the teacher that got moved at the beginning of the year at the corner of the building, where I've kind of co-opted that myself now. So I love we actually have one of our classes that's not actually used that much right in the center of the top floor. So I think that might be something that we're onto here, maybe, of kind of moving that around. We'll see, maybe down the road. But I guess here, so like the reason I kind of bring up like this is the first year in my district that this position has like, again, I don't think I don't have any like formal education background in like resource or anything like that. But what we've done is we've had the discussion about co-teaching. So I guess for you as a special education teacher, like how did you kind of blend yourself into the classrooms of other teachers without kind of overpowering or taking over, or just finding a good way to mesh yourself in with what they're already doing?
I'm just a little bit taken aback. So was this like this in Alberta for you too? This system?
No, so like what do you mean by this system?
Well, because you're just saying it's kind of a new position, and you're just talking about going into classrooms and kids coming out. It's just it feels like to me that, so what you're talking about, it sounds like, is a push in, pull out model. Have you heard that before?
No. No.
Okay, so
Yeah.
here's how I explain it, and this is
Hmm.
where, and I'll go to my new book again. Another pillar of my book is
Please,
the
absolutely, yeah.
instructional, yeah, is the instructional leadership component. So right now you're asking me a question on instructional leadership. How do
Hmm.
you, get into a classroom to teach with another teacher? And this is the part where the principal of your school, the vice principal, has to help you get the staff to understand the tiers of intervention, the RTI model, right? and and I like to use an accordion. So when I talk to my staff, I tell them it's very important when we're working with kids that we have all kinds of kids, right? We have kids who are introverted, we have kids who are extroverted, and we have ambiverts who are in the middle. We have kids who, would rather be pulled out to work with somebody one to one because there's less of a stigma. We have other kids who do not want to leave a classroom. They want to work with somebody in the classroom. They're all good. And then we have kids who some days want to be out of the classroom to get extra support, and the other day they want to be in. And so what I explain to my staff wherever I go is that the way we intervene, our interventions should look like an accordion, the big accordion with the piano. And basically when we're working with kids, if the staff understands that the learning assistance teacher, whoever that tier 2 teacher or tier 3 teacher is, one day, you know what, you might have Monday to Friday where you're not in the class at all because you're
Yeah.
you're pulling out, you're doing this, you've got one-to-one stuff, you need a quiet space, you need this. But then the next week the teacher might go, hey, I got these 3 kids in class, I can't have them out because I still need them to listen. Can you come in and help me kind of team teach, get this concept down? And then you'd be pulled in, right? And so it comes down
Okay.
to that communication piece and understanding that one day you might be pulling the kids out, the next day you might be pulling the kids in, and it's literally you're just doing this every single day, and it
Yeah.
can change hour by hour depending on who you're supporting, right? And
Yeah.
so that's the key, when you're kind of setting up a school or leading a school, you have to have that instructional component and that structural component as well. And the instructional piece is very important. Like, your teachers really need to understand why they're doing something. I don't know how many teachers I've had conversations with about, oh my God, we're going to another staff meeting and all they're going to do is tell me something they could have just put in an email.
Yeah.
And, so I take a lot of pride in, I've had to, in some schools, it was a bit of a tough haul trying to make your staff meetings more professional development based because it runs into some union issues. But once you
Mhm.
get past that and you start talking to teachers, like, no, let's solve problems. Let's get in here. I will send you emails for management stuff. We don't need to talk about, playground rules in a staff meeting. Here's the rules. Let's all try to enforce them, right? Or
Mhm.
whatever it is. That's a real mundane kind of an example. But
Mhm.
the best thing to do is to get into a staff meeting and really let's talk about the push in pull in model. What does that look like for you? What do you need support with? Because in most public schools, having that special ed assistant or that education assistant, there's not a lot of them, and teachers don't have one in every class like I do in my school because I'm at an Indigenous school.
Mhm.
But and it's really super important that if you are going to do a tier-based intervention and have interventionists like yourself, you've got to work around that push in pull out model and truly understand a teacher too, because you might have a teacher who'd be like, you know what, dude, I'm not as comfortable with you being in my class, but I am
Yeah.
comfortable with you taking these 3 kids and going and doing this. But then you're gonna have another teacher saying, please come in and help me with this,
Yeah.
right? And again, it comes down to the character and the personality of not only the kids you're working with, but the teachers you're working with, right? Unfortunately, we run into this issue when it comes to school leaders and principals, at times where it's they want to do it one or the other. It's either
Yeah.
push in and that's where we're putting all our eggs in that basket, or pull out, we're putting all that eggs in that basket. And I struggle with leadership and school districts that just take this is our philosophy. It's like, well, it's like here in BC, they've decided to ban cell phones in every school like they did in Ontario. And I just go,
Mhm.
oh my God. So basically, you've taken all those eggs and you've thrown them out. Meanwhile, those
Mhm.
grade 10, 11, and 12 teachers who depended on those kids to bring their cell phones to class because they're a computer,
Mhm.
you just kind of screwed them. And you're not teaching these kids how to use these tools in moderation and for academic purposes. And so it's one of those things where it's super important to not throw the baby out with the bathwater, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think like the main word that I've gone from, and I guess I think of the word responsive. Like that is kind of the role of that kind of supplemental teacher that's kind of that can support everywhere. It's that like the what you're doing changes from hour to hour, day to day, like depending on kind of what the needs are of the school at that time. Sometimes like yeah, I think you have to be adaptable as you go through, but think that's great advice of just not trying to silo it into being one thing, because then it just doesn't really
Mhm.
work or is not as effective for everyone. So we have touched on play a little bit here so
Yep.
far, and I know you often discuss like the play is the way theory, and so I think it's pretty self evident. I think like you hear the things of kids are kind of socialized by the age of like 3 and 4, and they kind of do a lot of these. They learn a lot of kind of negotiation and informal communication things like as they're kind of engaged in free play at a very young age. Do you think is kind of missing from the conversation when we discuss play and how to improve access to free play in our schools?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting question. Can you see the blue posters behind me here?
A little bit.
On
The
my
wording's a
little
bit
bit, yeah.
blurry,
So
but
yeah, there in BC we use a curricular competency and a core competency model for our curriculum, and the core competencies revolve around communication, collaboration, personal awareness, social awareness, creative thinking, critical thinking. And they're super important because those skills start to develop very, very, very early in a child's life with interaction, with social interaction, whether it be between their parents and themselves or between themselves and other children through play. And again, this is where technology comes in and technology's come in and has pulled that social interaction apart, which means we can't develop those core competencies as well as we used to. So one of the things we have to make sure we do is we have to make sure and I just want to digress a little bit here. Sometimes we get caught up on academics in schools, but you can't get to academics if kids aren't social emotionally ready and capable of doing the work, right? And it's the chicken or the egg kind of philosophy. It's like, hey, how about I go and do a numeracy or a literacy workshop, and I'm going to come out with the greatest, strategies and pedagogy known to man, and then show up and you can't teach it because your kids are, they're dysregulated, and so this goes back to that play piece. And there's free play and then there's structured play. And so you've heard me say play is the way. Play is the way is an actual program. It's a social emotional learning program that teaches mental health, that teaches emotional intelligence, that teaches all of those attributes, these competencies that are up behind me through structured play. And the key is to combine free play and structured play, and you bring them together so that way you can get to that academic piece and ensure success, right? And so, for example, I moved out of the public education system and I now work for the Lower Nicola Indian Band. I work for an independent school, and I don't have to follow government rules around whatever. We still follow the BC curriculum. We just have
mhm,
an Indigenous component in our school. We have an athletics program. We have all of those. Literacy, numeracy is really important. But one of the things I'm able to do is I'm able to structure my day how I think it should be structured. And so I've had the opportunity by evidence convincing the director of education, because there's no superintendent, that free play is crucial. So I actually have 2 recesses and a lunch hour at my school. And so we encourage that free play as much as we possibly can. And then on top of it, we've incorporated the Play is the Way program. So we have structured play that we start every Monday morning with. We'll all play a game and I'll teach self-regulation, emotional intelligence, and then these posters, you can probably see these colored ones back here. Those are the
mhm,
key concepts within the Play is the Way program. They're common language used from in every class, kindergarten to grade 7, secretaries, cooks, custodians, kids, everybody can refer to what color they are in terms of doing the right or the wrong thing,
mhm,
which attaches to our core competencies, which is all those character traits. And so, you know, being able to have free and structured play permanently embedded into your school and seamlessly. So it's not an add-on for teachers where they have to go find 30 minutes here or 40 minutes there to teach to it. It's just naturally embedded into everything we do, with the exception of Monday morning. I take about an hour every Monday morning and I do a big assembly, and we talk about emotions, we talk about self-regulation. I teach them mindfulness, breathing strategies. We do our recognitions for kids, if they're behaving well and stuff like that. And then
mhm,
they go off, and then the teachers may reinforce it with structured games of their own from the Play is the Way program. But the one thing that happens right across the board is we use the common language. Everybody understands self-soothing, mindfulness, and breathing strategy. So when a kid is struggling with their boots, for example, the teacher or whoever's interacting with the kid, that kid is like, okay, stop, let's take some deep breaths. And, and we'll use breathing strategies that we like. I wrote a book. I have a book called And Breathe, and it has 50 fun breathing strategies. And I wrote it to supplement the Play is the Way program in my emotional schools book. So we teach that seamlessly in there. But what happens is because you have free and structured play, with structured play, you can elicit emotion and teach kids to self-regulate because you're drawing the emotion out, you're drawing the behavior out, so you can teach them
Mhm.
to soothe. And then when they're in free play, when they're outside at recess or lunch, and they're interacting and they're getting into conflicts and they're trying to figure out games and stuff like that, they have to kind of figure it out on their own. And it's hard sometimes for teachers because they want to be controlling and they want to dive in and rescue kids when they're in the middle of a conflict. And
Mhm.
they're like, well, they're going to get into a fight. It's like, well, take a step back. Let's see how far they get. Like, we don't want kids to fight, and it rarely
Yeah.
happens, but let them have an argument. Let them
Yeah.
figure out how to do this. And then if it gets too far, that's when the EA or the supervisor, the teacher jumps in and says,
Yeah.
okay, Kate, you guys are going a little too far. Let's take some deep breaths. Let's make sure that our thinking is in charge, not our emotions, and let's work through this. And that's that co-regulation piece and that guiding piece. When I was talking about lawnmower parents, we don't
Yeah.
lawnmower for our kids. And so that's what play allows you to do. The free play allows kids to struggle through that gauntlet of life. And the structure play is what allows you to be proactive in teaching kids how to do and say the right thing and how to self-regulate and all that stuff. And then when you get to a place where you have all that play in your school and your social emotional well-being becomes stronger, those kids that were sitting on that fence that we were talking about in the beginning start to get pulled over here. And that's why I say it's a looming mental health crisis, because if our social emotional learning programs in every one of our school was strong, those 3 tiers of interventions would be a lot easier, because you're not dealing with dysregulated kids and behavior as much. You could literally pull a class in a school back to what it was like 15, 20 years ago when dealing with behavior in a class. It becomes 2 or 3 kids instead of the 8 or 9. And so that's how important play is. That's how important social emotional learning is. It's all really comes down to emotional intelligence. And it's so crucial to develop that early, like pre-kindergarten. We have to develop that. And that's, unfortunately, with play kind of, disappearing, kids aren't coming in with those skills, and hence the reason they can't cope with small, tiny, stressful things.
Yeah, and that's I know like and it seems to be pretty much up to kindergarten now is usually pretty safe with like dramatic play and play centers and these kinds of things for how they're talking. My wife's a kindergarten teacher, so I know a little bit about them,
God
that
bless
kind of
her.
stuff. So I know.
They're the hardest working teachers in the business. I don't care what
Yep.
anyone says. Nobody works harder than a kindergarten teacher.
Nope, they are constantly going. But yeah, they had two indoor recesses this week, and she's like, "This was absolutely chaotic." But anyway, the but it does seem to kind of go away like grade one for whatever reason. That like mental shift when we see kindergarten to grade, like you see a grade in front of a number, and you're like, "Whoa, okay, now we got to hunker down on these 6 year olds for their academics," which is obviously has its place of importance, but like this replacement it almost seems like we kind of overcorrect in our like
Mm-hmm.
changing for them to kind of go from kindergarten to grade one. um yeah, that's kind of just my little thought tangent on like the, I guess, like how would you infuse play into a classroom setting, because it sounds like what you're saying is that you've added more unstructured time to the daily routine
Yeah,
of
I stole
students.
our instructional time is actually the same. I just
Hmm.
stole it from places, right? We decreased the
Yep.
transition time between classes. We decreased lunch hour by about 3 or 4 minutes. And so by the time, I managed to kind of, decrease transitions. And that's, again, I talk about my new book. The other pillar is organizational leadership. Is I've organized my school soundly. So I found an extra 15 minutes without affecting the instruction.
Hmm.
Right. And when you do that, that's how I was able to, bam, create 2 recesses and have that third lunch. And not to mention the morning time when they get to school, they go out and play. And then, it's, so they're actually playing 4 times a day. But what you're referring to when you talk about when we get to grade one, if you look at the Japanese system and the Finnish system, kids aren't diving into academics like we do until grade 4. They're teaching character, they're teaching resiliency, they're teaching grit, and they teach literacy and numeracy, and it's supplemented
Hmm.
in, but they weigh more on child development in those systems, and they're leading the world in terms of academic success,
Mhm.
and so when I talk about, the free play, which is recess and lunch, the structured play, like you talk to any teacher, they probably all do brain breaks, or it's like, hey, let's take a minute and do this. In this Play is the Way program, there's 2 manuals filled with games that are you can play in 5 to 6 minutes in your classroom. Just like, hey, let's take a quick
Mhm.
brain break. Let's play time ball. Let's play dead ants. Let's play knotted arms. And what it does is it gets kids playing, and then you can, when they're playing and you listen to that emotion, you can teach them some soothing stuff. It's, okay, let's get back to our group work here. And it's just like that, right? And teachers are already doing it. They're constantly taking breaks, and they call them, a lot of teachers call it brain breaks, or, let's take a minute to soothe, or let's play heads up, 7 up, or whatever it
Mhm.
is. It's already there, right? And it's one of the beautiful things when I go and do a Plays the Way workshop for schools or wherever, and I talk about how it's embedded and how it's structured. Teachers are like, oh my God, I thought this was something different. I thought that this Plays the Way program meant I had to, do this play thing all. It's like, no, it's embedded into what you already do. It just makes it a lot easier, right? And that's the key, is that, school districts have to start believing in character development, and developing those core competencies around critical thinking and creative thinking and communication. Like, that's huge, right? I mean, you look at adults, if their communication isn't done well in a school between the leadership and teachers, you're going to be in a toxic environment. And it's no different for kids, right? If we don't teach kids to communicate and develop those interpersonal communication skills, you're going to have a toxic playground, right? And so it's super important to teach those things early. And it's quite frustrating when, schools see that grade 1, grade 2, and they dive into that. What they should be looking at in the primary grades is character development, and let's just call it literacy and numeracy development from K to 3. That's what we do. We do have grades, but I could care less. I could care less how old you are, what grade you're in. Where are you with your literacy? Where are you with your numeracy? And where do I bring in my support teacher, like Mr. Clark, to intervene to fill those gaps for those kids? And so
Mhm.
that way, by the time they get to grade 4, we've developed that character. We've got a solid literacy and numeracy foundation. And Bob's your uncle. Your kids are going to be well on their way, right?
Bob's your uncle. Oh,
Bob's your uncle.
no, I love it. 'Cause I'm even thinking like, yeah, there's so much. It's so obvious, but it's still there's always this little inkling of, oh, like that's gonna take away from my like academic goals and curriculum that I have to get to. And it's always like these curriculum intrusive thoughts that the teachers have of like the things that you have to. But again, there's some times where you have to realize that like these things are a net positive, even though if they might take away a couple minutes from your class or what have you. Um,
I challenge, Lucas, I challenge any teacher to put a blank sheet of paper on their desk, just take a pencil and do a tally of every single time they're interrupted by behavior in a day. Just do a tally. You do one
mhm.
line, you get to 5, it
Yeah.
crosses out. I guarantee you, by the end of the day, teachers are probably at 30 to 60 minutes of dealing with behavior interruptions in their day. 30 to 60 minutes. And that does not include, that just includes the interruption. That does not include the time it takes them to get that one kid to settle down and then bring the class and get them back into gear. And it's probably even more than 60 minutes. And so if you can shrink that down because your kids are able to self-regulate and they're not dysregulated, you will get there. I get so frustrated when, a provincial pro D comes up and teachers are running to the numeracy conference or the literacy, which is great. You need to get that
Yep.
pedagogy. But without strong mental health or emotional intelligence, you're not going to get to those academics as fast. You're just not. It's look at you. When you have a bad sleep and you're cranky, do you perform better or worse, right? Or if you're hungry, right? You struggle with those things. And it's the same thing, with adults. If we're not on top of our mental game, we're not going to put our best selves forward and learn as much. And it should be when you're talking about a school, it should be the main pillar in your school should be social emotional well-being and developing emotional intelligence, just like the Finnish do, just like the Japanese do. And we get so caught up in curriculum. Literacy, numeracy, social emotional learning, those should be your 3 pillars in primary school. And then you maintain it all the way through. Even in a high school, when you have kids who are going off to university and they get huge test anxiety, they don't know what to do with it because they can't cope, right? It's just one of those things. It's one of those things that I wished school districts and schools, and I'm seeing it more and more because I'm getting, like, I just got a call from a principal the other day who's in Victoria, and he's like, I need you to come in. I need you to bring this program in. We can't move forward with, with our, and Victoria's a pretty wealthy, I'm sure you know where Victoria is on the
Yeah.
island there. Like, it's a wealthy community. Parents are it's not a lot of low income issues or anything like that, but they're
One's love,
struggling.
though,
And
I imagine.
it's behavior. And I'm getting
Yeah.
calls because principals are going, we can't get to the academics. We can't. And that looming mental health crisis for some schools, they're already there. And now they're asking me to
Mhm.
come in. It's like, I need your help to pull these kids back because it's gotten so far that our school's becoming toxic. Teachers are at each other's throats because they can't get to the end of Monday without being like, I don't want to do this anymore.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, and that's part of the reason why I wrote the book, is because it's like, okay, wake up, you guys. We are on the fence. There's a reason why teachers are leaving the profession. There's a reason why teachers aren't coming into the profession. And it is a struggle, and it's all about emotional intelligence and emotional well-being. And yes, literacy, numeracy is crucial, and we will get to it, but we got to have kids who can self-regulate, before we can get to that stuff.
Yeah, and I feel like for as things have gone for myself, I guess my perception is either we change or die. Because if we have different needs now and we don't change, then what's going to be of our teaching profession in 10 years when we have another 15 to 20% that are leaving and even less kind of going into these programs? Like, if you can't allow a teacher to play a game for 7 minutes in their class without them feeling guilty or that someone's watching them, then it's
Mm-hmm.
understandable why people don't want to do it anymore. I
Yeah.
think that's a
Yeah.
pretty obvious point. But so, a couple more questions for you. I
Sure.
do. There's a couple things like I hear the polyvagal theory stuff a lot, and I
Mm-hmm.
know. I guess like I don't have a specific question here, but it's like, am I wrong here? Vagal nerve? There's a vagus nerve,
Vagus,
vagal
it's your
nerve.
vagus nerve. Would you like
Okay, I
me to
thought so.
dive in?
Absolutely, yeah. Like, what can you kind of add to this discussion? And like, it seems like a very complex psychological idea, but how can you kind of break it down?
So you, you just heard me say to you, if you don't eat, you're cranky. If you don't sleep,
Yeah.
you're not going to perform as well.
Hmm.
So your polyvagal nerve is connected to your amygdala and your prefrontal cortex. Okay.
Hmm.
And I might get it backwards. I don't know.
That's
The,
fine.
the
Yeah.
scientists out there might get on me, but your prefrontal cortex controls your fight, flight, and freeze response. Okay.
Okay.
So that polyvagal nerve, it goes right through your whole body. It's
Hmm.
everything. So all of your senses interact with your polyvagal nerve. So when I wake up in the morning, I put my feet on the ground. If the floor is cold, it's going to cause an emotional reaction for me. I'm going to go, oh, it's cold. I don't like the cold. Do you hear how I said I don't like
Yeah.
the cold? Instantly, I'm diving into my prefrontal cortex. Yeah, sorry, your amygdala controls your emotions. And
Hmm.
so there's a whole chapter on it in my book because it ties into this social emotional well-being. It ties into emotional intelligence. And so the way you interact with your physical space, the way you interact with people, the way you interact with the nutrients you're putting into your body affects that polyvagal nerve. And if your polyvagal nerve gets unbalanced, where you can't soothe it, that's where you dive into fight, flight, or freeze, right? And you have those kids who will storm out of a room, put their head down on a desk, or an adult who's just kind of cranky all the time, or
Hmm.
whatever. And what you have to do, and this is where the play piece comes in, the structured play piece, in where I was talking about eliciting emotions. You elicit the emotions so you can teach kids to self-soothe. Because if you're mindful, like you hear about meditation, you hear about that whole Zen thing, what you're doing is you're calming the vagus nerve. That's what you're doing. You're like, when you take deep breaths, those really deep diaphragmatic breaths that you take, it soothes that vagus nerve and it soothes your body, which then soothes your mind and allows your mind to be in charge instead of your feelings, right? You've witnessed road rage. You've witnessed people you watch adults all the time. You've been in staff meetings where it gets
Yeah.
emotional.
Yep.
Sometimes people, you just want to say, hey, dude, just take a deep breath for a second. You've
Yeah.
said it to yourself. I
Yeah.
guarantee you're like, oh man, I'm about to lose it here. I need to just calm. And really what you're doing is you're calming that polyvagal nerve, that vagus nerve that is connected to all your senses, so you don't fight, flight, or freeze, or your amygdala dives in and just makes you fiercely angry or fierce. Like even those kids who are just silly all the time because they're just having a good time, right? And you want to soothe them too. It's not just about anger and frustration
Yeah.
and sadness. It's about being silly. It's being overly, excited and
Hmm.
anxious, and so there's a science behind the emotions, right? And again, when we talk about academics versus social emotional well-being. Can you imagine teaching kids pre-kindergarten about the polyvagal nerve and getting them to understand if they soothe that vagus nerve through learning how to breathe and regulating their emotions, they're not going to have to dive into fight, flight, or freeze, or they're going to get too emotional one way or the other. And because they can soothe and we teach that early, can you imagine what kind of a society we had if everybody, instead of, I mean, probably go on Instagram and TikTok for us adults, there's all kinds of stuff just teaching us to self-soothe. And so that's why I love the Play is the Way program, because
Hmm.
and this is the thing, when I talk about it, they think that's, oh, it's all play, no, it's not. It's 5 minutes in your day. The key is that mental health, that polyvagal nerve, and teaching to self-soothe. And that's
Hmm.
why the Play program, is so important. And that's why understanding the science of emotions and the polyvagal nerve is so crucial, because emotions are science. It's the brain is the most complex subject in the world, because we only, I don't even know how much of our brain we use, but not much. But man, emotions control everything. And if you think of the good days you had at school where every kid is on, every kid comes in, they've eaten, they've slept, it's like, wow, that was a great day. I wish every
Yeah.
day was like that. I'd get these kids through.
You can
They're in
like
grade two,
feel it
they'd
in the
be,
room. So you can
you can
almost kind of
feel it.
feel like, oh, everyone's, and it kind of brings you up a little bit. You're like, oh, I'm not in kind
Mm-hmm.
of my normal going through the motion state. It's like I can actually feel something here a little bit.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think a lot of students don't understand this kind of idea that you can have a relationship with your mind. It's like the mind versus brain. It's like you have your brain that's kind of doing all the automatic things, but you can actually kind of use your mind to help your brain and consciously make decisions to actually live a better active experience. But
Yeah.
um, so this is a question I ask a few of my guests, and I want to get your thoughts on it. Is right now, obviously, you have a mic in front of you, but if you had the mic for 1 minute and the whole world was listening, and you could change one thing on education and they had to say yes, what would it be? What would you
Emotional
say?
intelligence.
Mhm.
Embrace emotional intelligence. Embrace the science of emotions. The more emotionally intelligent we are as a human race, not just our kids, the stronger our kids will be, the stronger our society will be, because we're just going to be able to cope. We're going to be able to self regulate, and we're also going to be able to communicate and collaborate in a very peaceful way and think of the things that we could solve and how creative we could be, and how our kids would be the most critically thinking generation of all time if we understood emotional intelligence.
Beautiful. So I got one more to kind of finish us off here. It's a quote that I think it's Albert Einstein's quote. It's education is what remains once we have forgotten everything we have learned in school. So, what is it that you want your students to take away with you, Mr. Slanzi? Or Slanzi, I'm not sure if I'm mispronouncing. What is it that you want your students to take away from their time with you that they won't get anywhere else?
Character. I want my kids to understand what it means to be empathetic, what it means to be compassionate, what it means to be kind, what it means to be tolerant, and what it means to work hard, what it means to persevere and to have grit and to be curious. And you combine all those things together, and I think we would have the most amazing kids in the world. And that's what I want when they're done with me, when they leave grade 7, or if I'm not a high school principal right now, but I was, but when they leave grade 12 or they leave elementary to go to the high school, I want them to be kind, caring, empathetic, hardworking human beings. That's what I want them to leave with.
Beautiful. All right. So just to kind of finish this off here for our listeners, where can they find you? What social medias are you on? And what are you currently working on?
You can find me at leroyslanzi.com. That's my first website. They can also go to playistheway.ca if they want to learn more about the Play is the Way program. I just finished my third book. It's out on Amazon, but I haven't announced it on social media, so no one knows that I
Okay.
finished it, except for people on Amazon and you, Mr. Clark.
Yeah.
And I'm starting my fourth book, which is on oh God, it sounds morbid. The Death of Attachment, which I'm hoping I'll get finished sometime
Ooh,
next year. Yeah,
I
diving
like
into it a
that.
little bit further. Yeah. Yeah, and and my email is pretty simple. It's leroyslanzi@gmail.com. But if you go on to leroyslanzi.com, you can find me, and I'd be more than happy to come and work with teachers, even come out east and do a workshop out in your neck of the woods there, Lucas, and
Absolutely, that'd be awesome.
indoctrinate your people. Yeah, you let me know. But yeah, it's it's
Together.
it's easy enough. Together, man. Yeah, for sure. I would love to come back east. I've never been to New Brunswick, so
Okay, right
set
on.
it up. Yeah.
Yeah, I love the death of attachment. That sounds like a very interesting project. So anyway, thank you very
Yeah.
much, sir, for coming on today. I appreciate your time.
Okay, man. Thanks for having me. Take care, Lucas.